Hello, and we're live. Yes, everybody should be working. If Carlton and Dry Apologist can say hello, just to
Hello.
check.
Hi.
Yeah, audio should be working. If there's any problems, anybody give a shout in, let me know. We'll try and fix it. So, yeah, thanks everybody for coming along. I know there's lots of other stuff on YouTube tonight, and yeah, more famous people and more interesting people, but we're fun. We're fun here. So I just want to say thanks to Carlton for coming. Thanks for the Dry Apologist for coming. All their information is in the description if you need it. But Dry, if you want to give a wee shill for yourself and just let everyone know who you are, and then Carlton, please.
All right. Yeah. So I have a YouTube channel, Dry Apologist, where I do some presentations, and I've been doing some live discussions lately. If anybody ever wants to drop by, anybody's welcome. And yeah, I'm a practicing Catholic. I'm really interested in philosophy and apologetics and theology. So that's that.
Carlton?
Yeah.
He just hides in the background. Takes 6 months to make a bloody video and hides in the background.
Yep. Yeah, as MathPig just said, yeah, Carlton, hello. I've been here before. Yes, it does take me about 6 months, maybe 10 years to make a new video. Currently working on one. Currently working on it. It'll be out whenever it's out. But yeah, I just make random videos that are more like personal essays about my life. So yeah, check me out.
Yeah, they're very in-depth. I really do. I must have watched your... I know I said this last time, but I've probably watched it maybe once at least since your last interview, man. Every time I look you up to put you in a video, because you've only got that one video, I can't find it by your name, so I have to type in Carlton Atheist, and the algorithm gives me your video. Then I watch it and find the link. Sorry, but it's very well produced, and it really does, not to be cliche, but the man opens his soul, so to speak, and really does, yeah, you tell everything from he was a wee lad and all that. And I'm not picking sides here, Dry. I just haven't watched any of your videos, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
So, Dry, as we discussed just before we come on, you have a particular topic which your favourite would be, well, your more preferable. So if you want to just give a wee intro on what that is, just for the people who don't understand, and then go from that. Carlton will bounce back and forth. I'm just going to sit in the background, and hopefully it'll not get out of control. I'll try and keep the conversation where it's going. Yeah, and we'll just go from there. I'll give you a wee shout and warnings and time downs and all that.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me, MathPig, and thanks for talking with me, Carlton. So yeah, I actually like both of these topics maybe equally, but I'm hearing a little bit of background, but that's all right. Okay, so we're going to start with the argument from contingency, which I also call the sustaining cause argument, just because for technical reasons. But anyways, I'm just going to give a broad outline, and I know that these arguments can be hashed out for a long time, and there's a lot of technicalities on it, so I don't expect it to be totally I don't expect it to just immediately convince somebody. It takes a long time, and even then, we can have disagreements. So I'm just going to go through just the basics. So basically, the argument is that contingent things are the types of things that exist or could exist, but they don't have to exist. So they could exist either due to a cause, so something else causing it, or exist simply due to chance. So sometimes that's called a brute fact. So something that just exists and just happens to exist, and there's no other further explanation that it's just there. While a necessary thing is something that has to exist. Now, I'm not presupposing that there is a necessary thing. I'm just laying out the definitions. And then, so if we consider contingent things and necessary things, we can ask, well, why do contingent things exist? And the argument is that if you take all the contingent things as a whole, whether there's an infinite number or a finite number, whether there's a multiverse or just a singular universe, whether they've always existed, but if we consider them all as a whole, we can ask, why does that whole, that contingent chain or collection of contingent things, why does that exist? And the argument is that it exists either due to a cause or due to chance. And I'm going to say that it can't be due to causing itself, and it can't be due to the contingent things causing one another to exist, because that's going to raise the question as to how did that contingent chain that causes itself, how did that come about in the first place? And not necessarily come about, but how does it exist in the first place? So I'm going to argue that it's then either due to chance or another cause. It can't be due to chance, and I have an argument for why, but so it's due to another cause, which would be a necessary being. And then once I unpack what a necessary being is, I'm going to argue that that has to have the divine, the traditional attributes of God, so the divine attributes. So just to kind of, so that's just kind of the broad outline. So basically, if we consider all the contingent things and ask why do they exist, the most plausible answer, it's due to a necessary thing, and that's God. So that's a broad outline. I know there are a lot of objections and finer details and such, but I'll just leave it there for now.
Okay. Could you give me a specific example of something that is contingent?
Sure. So I would say like I'm contingent, you're contingent, at least in the sense that our formation came to be. Now, maybe you could argue that the matter that makes us up is necessary. I would further argue that it's not, but anything that would come to be would be an example of a contingency.
Why wouldn't our matter be necessary? I'm not sure why that is.
Oh yeah, you could argue that it is. So that would be, the argument that I just gave wouldn't rule that out. So the next aspect of the argument is anything that has what I call fundamental limitations. So fundamental properties, I define as properties. Oh, and by the way, if anybody wants these notes and what I'm drawing upon, I have a presentation on my YouTube channel if they want to see all the slides and everything I'm using. But anyways, fundamental properties, I define as properties that don't need limitations than other properties in order to exist. So just like basic properties that wouldn't need some other limiting factor in order to exist. And that would be determined just by conceivability and intuition. So anything that has a limitation in fundamental properties would be a contingent thing. We can ask why is it fundamentally limited in that way and not some other way? So it has a modal contingency. So matter is fundamentally limited because matter is limited spatially. It also lacks other fundamental properties. It's not conscious and so on. So matter is, I'm going to argue, by its very conception, a contingent thing because of those fundamental limitations.
You said matter doesn't have consciousness, as in, but we're made of matter, so we have consciousness, right? So matter can't have consciousness.
If you want to argue matter as consciousness, that's fine. But if you're going to take the position that it doesn't, then that would be a limitation. But I guess we could just start with the fact that it's spatially limited would be enough in my mind to establish its contingency. Now you could argue the universe is necessary, and we could go there. But sorry, but I'll let you go now.
Your definition of fundamental properties is don't need limitations or it has no limiting factors. Do you have a specific example of something like that?
Sure. So it's not, when I talk about fundamental properties, I'm more just talking about the conception of these properties. So the examples that I give are things like power, presence, intelligence, love, justice. So those would be properties that we can imagine something having, but they wouldn't need another property to be limited in order to have that property. The only reason I make this distinction, and I hate that I have to, make the argument more complicated than maybe it seems like it needs to be, but because I know where some of these objections go, I have to make these further distinctions. But the reason is because there are some properties that it seems like something couldn't have unless it's limited in some other property. For example, you wouldn't be able to have colors or to have spatial features unless you're already limited to being within space. So those are the type of properties that I call second order properties. So these are properties that you would actually need a limitation in another property in order to exist. But properties like power, presence, intelligence, love, justice, I don't see what other property would need to be limited in order to have those properties. Now you can make the case for it, but I would need to hear the case for it. And that's why I call those fundamental properties.
Well, those don't seem, well, of course I'm going to object to that because those things that you just mentioned, love, justice, power, intelligence, and things of that nature seem to be well, as you mentioned, they're conceptions of properties, but those seem to be conceived by us. So they seem to be contingent upon conscious beings, if you will, to perceive them. So they are contingent, not necessarily fundamental. And those are just descriptors of concepts that we seem to recognize.
Sure. Yeah, the concepts themselves. I mean, you couldn't have a concept without a mind conceiving it. But I just mean that I don't think that I'm not a Platonist, so I don't think that these properties are just like out there in their own heavenly universe or something. But I think that it would be proper to say that there are things that have power and presence, intelligence, love, and justice. I don't think that those things just exist because I think of them.
No, that's not what I'm arguing. I'm just arguing that those things seem to be dependent on minds to conceive them for our limited experiences. But I'd like to have you further elaborate on what you specifically think about those things, right? So you said you're not a Platonist, but what do you specifically see in that regard?
So I would consider myself more of a conceptualist. So I think that properties are at least the labels. So that's where this gets a little bit tricky. The labels are concepts, but the properties still really are there. I'm not an idealist, so I don't think, like, if I say something has presence, I don't think that's merely a product of my mind. I think if something has presence or power, it really has that externally to my mind. Now, the label of it is a product of my mind, but I would say it's still proper to say that thing has power, that thing has intelligence. Like, you have an amount of power, you have an amount of intelligence and presence and so on. I don't think that that's a product of my mind. The label is, but the actual feature, I would say, is not.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like what you're, at least the way I'm understanding it, it sounds like what you're trying to say is that thing, or you have power as I would recognize power, or as we sort of, we think as thinking beings, excuse me, recognize what we think power is. That's what it sounds like you're saying to me.
Yeah.
Okay. But do you think these things are actual tangible things?
No, not necessarily tangible. I would say at some level there is some tangible quality. But I mean, the argument would be compatible with idealism as well. If somebody wanted to argue idealism, or, you know, any version of, you know, conceptualism, so on, I don't think is necessary for the argument. So I don't know that power and intelligence, I wouldn't say they're tangible, but they're proper labels that we can properly apply to things.
Right, sure. I would agree that they're labels that we would apply to things that we think recognize that phenomena. But getting back to the fundamental aspect of it, I'm not quite sure what makes them fundamental.
Well, the fact that, yeah, I don't want to get hung up. I don't, but yeah, this is a good point though. So when I'm saying they're fundamental, I just mean that they don't necessarily, there's no logical necessity for there to be other properties in order for them to exist. Now, again, you could argue that they need another property in order to exist, but there's no logical connection. It's not like I could imagine something having power, presence, intelligence, love, and justice, and being a completely unlimited, infinite thing. But like something like being spatially confined, you would need to be limited in space in order to be spatially confined. So that's more what I mean about fundamental and secondary properties. It's not like you need to be limited in something in order to have power.
I'm sorry. Could you elaborate just a bit more, or go over that again?
Sure. So you wouldn't need to be limited in some other feature in order to have power. It just is like you could imagine somebody just having power and that's it. But if you say something is spatially limited, like it's here and not there, it would need to be, so it has some spatial feature, some spatial texture. You would need to be limited in your presence. You would need to be limited to one location in order to have those spatial features. So you have to invoke a limitation in order to have those properties. But for a fundamental property, you don't need to invoke a limitation in order to have those fundamental properties.
Okay. But what would be the logical necessity? You mentioned that. I'm not quite sure what that means.
Sure. So it would be, so I don't see how it would be logically conceivable, for example, for something to and maybe it is, honestly, like I'm fine either way on this point. It's more just this is actually trying to clarify the point, but actually if it doesn't, then we don't have to focus on it for that long. But I couldn't imagine, for example, a rainbow existing without being confined within space. You know, having color and spatial features seems like something has to be confined to being within space in order to have those features. So you have to already invoke a limitation for those properties. But like if I say something is all powerful and all intelligent, I don't have to invoke any limitation in order to have those properties.
Well, could it be that the reason you can't personally perceive that thing is because you're so used to your limited experiences? That doesn't necessarily mean that something couldn't be that way, right? Especially, I'm not sure if you believe, well, let me go with, I'm sure you believe that your God is all powerful or is capable of anything. So isn't it possible that this God could create that reality or of whatever in which that is the case then? So it wouldn't make that necessary. It wouldn't make a lot of these, like love, justice, power, intelligence, necessary. But perhaps just within our reality, this seems to be the case. But maybe within another reality or another possible world, if you will, that it's something completely different.
Sure. So I mean, I think that God is limited. So I think, and this is another distinction, I'm looking for my notes here. I think God is limited by the laws of logic and also by moral laws. I don't think that there are things that exist like outside of him. Again, I'm not a Platonist, but I think that he is limited in the same way that we're limited by logic and morality. So I would say that no, God couldn't create a universe in which, say, the basic laws of logic don't apply or what I'm mapping out doesn't apply. I would say, you know, it does apply to him as well. And when we get to the problem of evil, I'll probably make more clarifications on omnipotence. But basically, omnipotence I define as that God, or the power to bring about any conceivable state of affairs, assuming it doesn't conflict with other properties. So it gets kind of technical, but yeah, I think that God can bring about any sort of physical universe, but I don't think he can violate the laws of logic.
Well, again, that relies solely on how we perceive the laws of logic, right? So, yeah, that looks at the laws of logic as though this is the foundational laws in any conceivable world. The laws of logic operate the same way that we perceive them. But isn't it possible? Well, you said that this God is limited by these laws of logic, which is an interesting sort of way to look at it. If it's all powerful, but it's limited by this thing. But yeah, it's really odd to say that, at least to me, that saying something is that the laws of logic, that this God is limited by the laws of logic, which assumes that the laws of logic as we know them are the ultimate laws of logic. They cannot be any other way. I'm not quite sure how that is, how you can come to that conclusion, rather.
Sure. So a couple of points there. I think it actually is the traditional conception of God. Like if you go back to someone like Thomas Aquinas, to recognize that God is limited by logic, not because the laws of logic are something outside of God limiting him, but rather that they're necessary descriptions. So it's not that like the law of non-contradiction is some other item out there that's making things a certain way. It's just that it's just not possible for anything to violate it. Now, I recognize that there are different forms of logic. So when I say the laws of logic, I'm meaning it applied to concrete reality. So like that there can't be something that exists and fails to exist at the same time. Now you could argue against that, but I would say I would need to hear the argument. So I take a foundationalist view here that, you know, there seems to be nothing more evident than a claim that something can't exist and fail to exist at the same time. So if somebody wants to argue against that, I mean, they can, but I don't know what plausible argument they're going to bring forth. So that's kind of, I think we all have a starting point. That would be a starting point for me.
What do you mean by necessary descriptions? Like, I think it's mostly, I know your definition of necessity essentially is that it has to exist. So something to be a necessary description, that almost seems off to me. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So necessity has different definitions, and so at the beginning I did define something which must exist and without a cause. So that's when we're talking, and I would say, like, yeah, the laws of logic must exist and without a cause. But there's also a modal necessity, like could not have been otherwise, and I would say that applies to anything necessary as well. So anything necessary must exist and without a cause and could not have been otherwise. So when I say it's a necessary description, it's a description that would have to apply to every possible world and could not have failed to apply.
How would one determine that something couldn't have been otherwise, especially given that we are incredibly limited with our experiences? So I'm not even sure how one could then arrive to, oh, this thing does necessarily or couldn't have existed any other way. I'm not sure how you would arrive to that conclusion. I can't talk tonight.
Oh, it's all right. So yeah, I mean, if you can generate a deductive argument, for a necessary being, and then the attributes that it would deductively have to have, that would be a way. But just to start with something more basic, like, I mean, do you think that there could be like a married bachelor or a rock that exists and doesn't exist? I mean,
not from what we see currently, like not how we've experienced things currently. Maybe I'm not currently seeing how we could then arrive to saying that something couldn't have been otherwise, though.
Well, I was just starting with that as a foundational point. So I don't take it like that there couldn't be a married bachelor because I've never encountered one, or could it be a rock that exists and doesn't exist because I've never seen one. It's just that those things to me are just incoherent. So that would just be my foundation. It would just say, look, that the law of non-contradiction applies to at least concrete reality. There are some paradoxes that I would say could apply to abstractions, but when I'm talking about concrete reality, so things that are causal, that we interact with, that have existence to them, that the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the law of identity necessarily apply to those things. And then, so that would be just in principle a way to determine that something could not have been otherwise. So, like a married bachelor is just an impossibility. If somebody's a bachelor, they could not be married in that circumstance. Now, that doesn't prove that there's a necessary being. I would need to unpack why there's a necessary being, and that would go back to my argument that if the collection of all contingent things, or I call it the chain of contingent things, exists due to a cause or due to chance, then, I should say just due to external cause or due to chance, then and it can't be due to chance, and I know I need to provide an argument for that, but then the cause of it would be a necessary thing. So that would be a way to deductively arrive that the collection of contingent things needs a cause, and that would be a necessary thing.
Yeah, well, the thing is, though, I do feel bad that I keep harping on this point.
Oh, it's fine.
But all of this really just arrives back to my objection here. I think would be the biggest objection, which is the basal. You seem to have this basal assumption that things must always, like, this is the best possible world, and that these are the laws as they are, or the necessary descriptions as you call them, which ignores the fundamental aspect that things could be different, that this just may not be the way. This may not be the best possible way. So I'm not quite understanding that. Again, not quite understanding how we could then arrive to, well, this thing is necessary and this thing is necessary. So I've still not heard how we are able to arrive to this thing being necessary. All I'm hearing are descriptors, the laws of logic, laws of excluded middle, law of identity, law of non-contradiction. Yeah, I get those. Those are descriptions of patterns that we recognize. I'm not understanding how we can then say, well, these things are necessary. These are the attributes of something being necessary, and this is a specific thing that is necessary, not just concepts that we think are necessary.
Right. So it gets down to your epistemology. So I take it as just intuitively obvious that those basic laws apply to concrete reality. There couldn't be. And you said best possible world. I don't know that it's the best. It's just the way that it is. It's just there is no possible world in which those laws of logic fail to apply. Again, not because there's some platonic force that's making it be the case. It's just there just is no possible world where there's a married bachelor. There just is no possible world where a rock exists and fails to exist. Now, if you want to argue that there is or there could be, okay, but I mean, that's just where we would depart. I would just say I just have a very deep foundational intuition that that's just false. So I would need to hear to me, from my starting point, I would need to hear a compelling reason why to doubt that deeply held intuition. Now, maybe you don't. Maybe you are skeptical of that intuition, but I'm just not. So I guess that's just kind of my starting point.
Well, my skepticism comes from more so hearing you say that this thing just is, or these things just are, or these things are necessary. So what I'm getting to, or at least trying to get to, is how do we arrive to these things being necessary? Or even going more specifically, just getting to the nitty gritty, this specific thing right here is necessary because of this thing, right? So where is that? Offer
right.
that.
Okay, so that's where I think maybe the question is already maybe going in the wrong direction when you say it's necessary because of this thing. No, something's necessary. It's just necessary. There is no because. It just has to be. So when I say the law of non-contradiction applies to concrete reality, that's just the way it has to be. There is no because. It's necessary. Now, just like 1 + 1 = 2, it's just necessary. There is no why beyond that. Now, we may disagree on that point, but to me, that's just is self-evident.
What makes it self-evident?
Well, I mean, self-evident is just self-referential. I mean, 1 + 1 = 2. It just does not equal 3. I mean, to me, that's end of story.
Sure, but what makes the law of non-contradiction or anything like that just self-evident?
It just is. I mean, a rock can't exist and fail to exist at the very same time. That's where I would say, well, hey, that's a contradiction, and that presupposes the law of non-contradiction. Like, the cogito ergo sum. I can't doubt my own existence. Like, I would have to exist in order to doubt my own existence. It immediately arrives at a contradiction within a concrete thing. I mean, once you arrive at a contradiction within a concrete thing, it's an impossibility.
Well, it sounds like, at least from my understanding, that we're hitting a block, right? We're hitting a wall of our own limited experiences. So therefore it's like, oh, okay, this thing, it doesn't seem like we can go beyond this point. So therefore it's a necessary thing. That's what it sounds like to me. Or at least it's, oh, I already presume this specific thing. So let me then arrive to, or let me try to find things that further my conclusion. And that's what, I guess that's what more of my objection seems to be, is that I hear, oh, law of non-contradiction, these laws of logic, they're just so self-evident. And I'm like, well, what makes them self-evident? Because I keep, the reason I keep bringing that up is because we have these limited experiences. So having limited experiences should tell you, oh, what if there's more to this than just, oh, well, this is the foundation. And I'm not sure how you're able to go like, no. This definitely is the foundation. Not there's more to it. No. this is how we've arrived to this being the foundation.
Right. So I'm drawing upon what I consider to be the most plausible seeming foundation. So I think that you're drawing from, so your objection, I think, is presupposing a foundation of an epistemic foundation, and my argument is assuming an epistemic foundation, and they may not be the same one. So when you say, well, based on our experience, I would stop you right there. No, it's not based on our experience. It's just based on the immediate obviousness that something can't exist and fail to exist at the same time. That's just immediately obvious. It's not because I've taken an examination of a number of items and I reached a conclusion based on induction. It just is obviously impossible. Now, if you want to bring an argument for its possibility, that you can, but I'm more skeptical of the idea that there's a possible world in which a rock exists and doesn't exist at the same time. I'm more skeptical of that than anything. So if the objection to this argument saying, well, that could be a possible world, I'm going to be very skeptical. I'm going to be, that doesn't undermine my confidence in any argument that presupposes that foundation.
Yeah, sorry. I do apologize if it seems that I would be objecting.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, just just before everybody gets out of control, you just could go on in this one topic for ages, and it can go on as much as everybody's enjoying it. I was just wondering if Dry has two statements he could make, and if Carlton could then address them two statements. And we could probably, if anyone's got any questions that specifically on this topic, if you want, we can continue in this topic. I'm happy and enjoying this. I think the audience is as well. But if you want to go on to the other one, it is there as well. It was mentioned, and if it's up to yourselves.
Sure. Well, I just want to make sure that I clarify just to make sure this is clear. So when I'm saying that the laws of logic are necessary, and I'm saying there's a necessary being, I'm not equating the two. So and I think that sometimes, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but sometimes there's an assumption that I'm like saying the laws of logic are necessary, therefore there's a necessary being. But I'm not making that step. I'm saying I take the laws of logic as necessary for discovering what could be necessary or contingent about reality. But I'm not jumping from the law of non-contradiction is necessary, therefore there's a necessary being. So I just want to make sure that point's clear.
Okay, yeah, that makes it clear, because that's pretty much what I was thinking you might.
I was afraid of that.
So, yeah.
It's easier just sometimes just to say it in a statement rather than, it's nice to be nice and go on and make your point very clear, but at the end of the day, sometimes it's easier just to say that cow's a cow, it's black and white, If you want to, anything you want to come back at that with, Carlton, before we move on, or continue, if you just want to continue.
I guess what maybe I'm just getting hung up on something. Like it didn't sound like a more apt sort of definition of necessary descriptions was offered. I know an example with being, the laws of logic, but what specifically is a necessary description, or how would you define a necessary description?
Sure. I mean, and we're going to hit a point where it's like we kind of run out of words because it's just kind of a basic, intuition. But like, I really can only give examples to help clarify. Like 1 + 1 = 2. Like that just seems mathematically necessary. The law of non-contradiction, just in applying to concrete things like a married bachelor, existing rock, and so on. Those just seem like that's and the reason why I use the word description is because I don't think there is some law of non-contradiction out there. Like we could find it, like, oh, there it is. It's just reality just could not be caught in a concrete contradiction. It just there just is no existent, non-existent rock that could come about if we just give it enough time. That's just impossible. Just like 1 + 1 will never equal 3. So I call that necessary description. Maybe there's a better way to label it. That's what I call it, but
right. P can't be not P at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess we can move on to the problem.
Right. And I just want to clarify that in itself does not at all prove my argument. So I just want to, so if anybody's thinking like, oh, he thinks he's proving it, not at all. That was just kind of clarifying some of the terms. I think once you accept the terms of the argument, you can see how the argument can at least be plausible and make sense. But I mean, this can we'll actually have another debate about this tomorrow. But I mean, yeah, it can go a long time. I would recommend somebody, and I don't know if Carlton, if you've watched any of my debates or videos, but hopefully they clarify some of the points. But I know that it gets really complex, and there's a lot of avenues it can take. But anyway.
Yeah. Perfect. We'll round that up. We'll agree to disagree. At least everybody's put their points across. If either of us have been not convinced, at least somebody have gotten in the audience has got some things to think about. Carlton, if you want to just let me know what that blue stuff is you're drinking, because it looks powerful.
No, it's like just blue lemonade.
No, seriously. Problem of Evil, if you want to give a wee synopsis of what that is, let everybody know, and then go from that and see where Dry can push you on that.
All right. From what I understand, I've never actually really talked with a lot of theists on the problem of evil. But from my understanding of the problem of evil, it seems to be that it's the assumption that the various descriptions that particularly Christian apologists give of God is that God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. So therefore, so therefore, things like disease and murder and all these other things and whatnot are in the world and present in the world, and God has the ability to get rid of these things. So from what I've heard from various atheists and skeptics trying to argue against it, it's that, well, that seems like a contradiction if God is all these omnis, but it still allows awful things to happen to people. So that's sort of like a basic description or summary of the problem of evil for folks.
Yeah, well, why does it exist? And
you're right, exactly.
Basically just sums down to, if God is amazing and all that there, if he's perfect, why could he not create a perfect place for us? And if heaven is that perfect place, why do we have to go through this to start with? Like, just skip the journey and get to the end. Obviously, it's always what they say, the journey is not the destination, but, a perfect being should be able to create a perfect place. So,
exactly.
Dry, or if you've anything to add to that, or start off with a reason, explain to us the problem of evil and why it exists.
So I don't have the definitive answers, sorry, but I do have a response that I like, and this is a topic that I really enjoy discussing and studying. But yeah, essentially, if God's all powerful, he can stop suffering. If he's all knowing, he knows about it. If he's all good, then he would want to, and perhaps be obligated to. And the way that I like to approach it is, so a lot of times theists will argue the free will defense, which I think can help, but I don't think it goes all the way. So just to keep it basic, the free will defense being that, if God gives us the freedom so we can choose a good path or an evil path, then that's going to result in being able to will evil actions. And I think that makes sense in regards to moral evil, but it's difficult to explain that in regards to natural evil, like diseases and so on. And it doesn't explain all of moral evil either, but I think it's a good starting point. So I kind of go from there, and I've developed, it's not really totally my idea, but it kind of is, but I call it the perfect will theodicy, and that's just the name. It doesn't matter the name. But basically the argument is that, so in heaven, that everything will operate in perfect accordance with God's intellect, so his intelligence, and his will, because that would just be a perfect reality, or at least it's plausible. You could argue that that's not, but at least that's a plausible conception, that everything in heaven will operate in perfect accordance with how God sees it, how it's the best way it should be, which is what the problem of evil seems to be based on. Why didn't God create that universe? But then I argue, similar to what the free will defense sometimes argued, is that God can't force somebody into a relation with God. And if heaven is a kind of relation with God, which is certainly in line with the Christian understanding of heaven, and God couldn't force somebody into it, not because he lacks the power to, but because it would violate his justice to force somebody into a relation with him, then he can't force somebody into that perfect world where everything operates in perfect harmony with God. So he has to start people out in a pre-heavenly world. and that's the world that we inhabit. So in a pre-heavenly world is not heaven, so things don't operate in perfect harmony with God's intellect and will. But if they don't operate in perfect harmony with God's intellect and will, then that opens the door to there being suffering. So that's the rough outline. So I'm not arguing that God does this because he's bringing a greater good out of every instance of suffering. I actually think that that's a problematic way that theists, Christians often argue. And I don't argue that, rather that there can be gratuitous suffering in our pre-heavenly world. That's just because things don't work the way that God wants them to. And again, it's not because he lacks the power, it's because it would violate his moral nature to force beings into this heavenly universe. So that's kind of the rough outline there.
So I want a bit more clarification on something. So you first said God's justice, but at the end there you said God's moral nature. Are those the same thing?
Sure. Yeah, I would say they're the same thing. I mean, basically, I think at least most of morality, I think, breaks down into justice. But if somebody wanted to split hairs there, yeah, I mean them in the same way. Yeah.
And what do you mean by justice or God's justice in this?
Sure. The same justice that I would say that we use just on an everyday basis, that you have, I define justice, I know this isn't maybe the traditional way, as respecting to others. So if you have an obligation, I have an obligation to respect you as an individual and to treat you equally, just like MathPig and anybody else. And I would say that God has that obligation from himself as well. So basically it's treating others with the kind of fairness and charity.
Well, I would argue you don't have an obligation to respect people, but I would give a bit of pushback, which is funny that we're talking about justice for a little bit here, because my next video is kind of about justice. But
it'll be all right. Everybody
seems to be that justice, people have different ideas of justice, so it seems more subjective in that way, that we can't all, I guess, fairness, again, we're getting into concepts that people won't entirely agree upon. So sticking to God's justice, it seems that you're saying that God's justice is our justice, so I guess whatever we view as justice, that's the same thing that God views as justice?
Sure. So I'm just saying that there's a commonality. So when I say like God, so it's like sometimes I hear theists arguing like, well, God's justice is so much different, and it seems like it's and I push back on that. I don't think that we should understand God in these radically different moral terms where, you know, things that would be immoral for us are actually moral for God. I don't argue that, but I do think that God is a different being. So perhaps some of his moral considerations, and I would say obligations, but we don't have to get hung up on that term, but are perhaps different than ours because of the context in which he exists and relates to us. But it's there's still an analogical similarity. It's not like it's so radically different that I'm now divorced and taken out any substance of what we would mean by the word justice. I don't want to get hung up on the word justice. Basically, though, what I mean is that it's within God's moral nature that he can't force beings into a relation with him. And if we want to call that unjust, or you want to call it something else, I'm not worried about that. The more of the argument is it would violate God's moral nature to force beings into a relation with him.
And that moral nature would be its justice.
Well, whatever God's moral nature is, I would say that justice is a proper way to describe it. If you wouldn't want to apply that term, that's fine. I'm fine with the term, but maybe God's moral nature is just radically mysterious. I mean, I'd like to think that it makes some sense. Like if I say somebody does something wrong, I'm likely to probably say that's an unjust action. Like, why did you do that? That was unjust. If I had to really unpack why it was wrong. So if God does something wrong, I would use the same type of language. I don't think God can do something wrong, but conceptually speaking, I like the word justice. But if you don't want to use that word, that's fine. It's just whatever his moral nature is.
Hey. So would you say that our, I guess, goal or purpose is to get to heaven in accordance to your theology?
Yeah, definitely.
and that would also be God's goal or reason for creating all of us, is for us to get to heaven.
Yeah.
Okay, so wouldn't it be, if this being is all powerful, is it really beyond the being's capability to create some sort of mechanism that allows it to create a world in which things like murder and all this other things and whatnot do not exist, creating this mechanism that doesn't contradict its moral nature or whatever?
It's so it's conceivable, but I'm going to say it's not feasible. So because it would violate, because if God were to create that type of world, would be a world in which everything operates in accordance with God's will, is the argument. Is at least that I'm making. I'm not saying that convinces you, but, and I'm saying, so if, sure, God wants that world, but it's not feasible to create a pre-heavenly world where everything operates in accordance with God's will, because that would be heaven. So the pre-heavenly universe is one where it doesn't. But if it doesn't, then that opens up a kind of Pandora's box. Now we can have things that don't operate in accordance with God's will. So I agree that ideally we would want God to create a pre-heavenly world where there was no suffering. Things operated according to the way that God would want. But I'm arguing that while it seems conceivable, it's actually not possible.
Well, I'm not arguing that your God would want that. What I'm mostly arguing, or I'm objecting to, is that if this entity is all powerful and capable of creating such a world, but also, at least to me, that it also logically follows that this entity is capable of creating some sort of mechanism that allows that type of world to exist without it contradicting its moral nature, especially since the purpose of us, according to your theology, is for us to praise God and to be with this deity in heaven. So this deity could just create the mechanism that just gets rid of all of the nastiness and blah blah blah, and just like, oh no, I already create you with glorifying me and not having to go through all these other things. I created this mechanism that allows it to be possible for you just to straight up glorify me.
Yeah, I'm arguing that it's not possible, not because it's not that there's a contradiction within God's power, but when you bring in God's moral nature and the contingencies that follow from God being willing a universe that things don't perfectly conform to his will and his intellect, that opens up, that necessarily opens up the possibility of there being suffering. So it's not, I'm arguing that it's not possible for God to create it. Again, not because it's not because of his power being limited, it's because his moral nature limits his power in that regard.
Is this deity capable of changing its moral nature or any aspect, or creating any sort of like any mechanism, I keep using that word, to change that?
No. In my conception is, and again, when I'm putting this forward, it's a rebut. So I'm saying this, as long as this is a reasonably possible hypothesis, then I'm saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be true, but it's at least plausibly true, then it would work as a response to the problem of evil. So no, I mean, God's a necessary being. He can't change his necessary nature, no.
Why?
Because that's what it means to be necessary. It'd be like recreating yourself.
Oh, I guess, okay. What makes the deity necessary? Let's start there.
Well, I guess that would get us back into the contingency argument. He just has to exist. He's just the ground of existence.
I'm not sure what that means.
Like, it's just so that fundamental, I don't know if this is going to help, just that fundamental level, like maybe you would conceive of like quantum physics being like the ground of existence. So like whatever is the most fundamental aspect of reality, that's what God is. He's not physics, but he's more fundamental than physics.
You said quantum mechanics or quantum physics?
Yeah, I was using that as an analogy. Like somebody could say, like that's the ground of existence. It's like the most fundamental aspect of reality. So in classical theism, God is the ground of existence. He's the most fundamental causal aspect of reality. He's the thing that gives existence to everything else.
But can we not say that at least that one of them, in either God or quantum mechanics, one of them can be mathematically proven or at least physically proven to one, a wee bit more than the other? That's all I'm gonna say. There's more evidence physicality in the world for one than the other.
Yeah, empirically, yes. But empiricism doesn't prove whether something is necessary or not.
What would prove or demonstrate that something is necessary?
You can't think something into existence.
Right.
Right. Well, I would argue that the argument from contingency does. Now, we may not agree, and I would need to unpack it some more, but I would argue that, if that argument's accepted, that would prove a necessary being.
I'm not sure what... It sounds like you've already defined this being to... Let me go back. It sounds like, okay, you've got this definition of necessary, and then you're like, oh, my God also so happens to fit this specific definition of necessity. And then it's like, well, what makes it that necessary thing? How is it specifically fitting that definition versus I could say that androgynous fairies tickle my genitalia to wake me up in the morning. They're necessary for me to wake up in the morning, and not just necessary for me to wake up in the morning, but necessary for the universe to exist.
Now, is that because with or without feather dusters?
I've defined necessity in this way. So I'm not sure how you're able to arrive to this specific deity versus androgynous fairies.
Right. Well, I would need to unpack, the contingency argument some more, but I want to make a clarification. I'm using the word, you said necessary for, so that would be a more pragmatic use of the word necessary. Like it's necessary that I go to the grocery store if I want food tonight, but that's a different sense of necessary. This is necessary as in necessary existence, so something that has to be. And I don't know that you intended to make a distinction there, but I just want to make sure that that was clarified.
Well, my point would still stand. I'm just not sure how we would say that it's this specific deity and this specific ideology versus this thing that Carlton just made up. I'm not sure what.
Right, but I just wanted to clarify that there are different senses of the word necessary. So necessary for and necessary that are two different things, but they're two different conceptions. But why couldn't the necessary being be fairies? Okay, well, I would say fairies have fundamental limitations. Unless you're going to ascribe that they're just totally unlimited beings, and then they're, and that's God. So they're contingent if they exist, which I don't think they do.
Well, let's see. I'm not sure why it couldn't just be these fairies. Like you're just, well, these fairies can be because they're limited in this aspect. But my God definitely is necessary for mysterious reasons. I'm not quite sure what specifically makes it, other than defining it into necessity.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think it's coherent that the universe could be necessary? Like, excuse me, that it has to exist?
I'm not sure.
But do you think it's coherent?
Could be.
Okay. I mean, I would say it's coherent. I mean, you gave that fairies example. I mean, I agree that's coherent. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the fact that I argue that God's necessary, especially in the context of responding to the problem of evil, which is a response, it's a defense. It's not, I'm saying, because the person who's arguing the problem of evil is entering into an internal critique of things I already presuppose. So if I'm saying, well, hey, because you asked me, could God change his nature? And I say no. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, in the context of the problem of evil, it just has to be coherent. It has to be at least plausibly true. We're working within my theology. Now, if you're going to say, yeah, but prove that God's necessary. Okay, well, then we get back into where I have the burden of proof to prove that. But in responding to the problem of evil, I don't think I do. I just think I have to give a coherent explanation. But if we want to go back to the contingency argument and argue, why would God be the necessary being? why would there be a necessary being? We can do that, but then that'll get back into that other argument.
Sure, but I'm not. I hope it's not coming across as I'm telling you to just prove that your God is the necessary being. I'm more asking what attributes it has that make it necessary, independent of the definition of necessity that you gave earlier, right? Going to back to the example of laws, not of the laws of logic, which you've described as self-evident. Sure, yeah. Well, this deity, this extra thing now has been brought into the picture, and now it seems to be, oh, I've defined this being as these things that just so happen to conform to my previous definitions of certain properties and certain examples that I've offered, not really giving anything else that further validates that deity. It just so happens to be the perfect puzzle piece, and that's really odd to me. I'm not sure how you would arrive to that.
In responding to the problem of evil, I can invoke a puzzle piece, because the person who's arguing the problem of evil is putting forth the argument. They have the burden of proof that, like, they're going to say there's a logical contradiction in God existing, and by God I define as a necessary, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being, and then I can qualify those attributes. And then if you say, well, can God change his nature? And I say, well, no, he's necessary. And you say, well, prove that. To me, that's kind of shifting the burden of proof for the person, if you're putting forth the problem of evil. Now, if you want to get back to, have I proven that God is necessary? Then sure, I can take on the burden of proof again. But in the context of the problem of evil, I think I can invoke a puzzle piece. But going back to the argument from contingency, why is there a necessary being? Because if we consider the collection of contingent things, now if you think there are no contingent things, that's fine, then there's a necessary thing. But either way, if we're going to consider the collection of contingent things, why do they exist? It's either due to a cause or due to chance. I'm going to argue that it can't be self-caused, can't be due to chance, therefore it's due to a necessary thing. Thereby there's a necessary thing. That doesn't mean that necessary thing is God, but it means that there's a necessary thing. So that would be a deductive syllogism that would lead to the conclusion that there's a necessary being, if it's accepted. I'm just laying out the argument.
Sure.
So you could challenge a facet of that argument, but that would be how I would get to that there's a necessary being.
Right. So it seems to be that it's convenient in the sense that God isn't capable of changing. God is capable of changing various other aspects, but not able to create other aspects that also can't contradict its nature, even though it can create just about anything.
Well, spell that out a little bit for me, because I haven't argued that God can change necessary things. I've argued, so I would say he can change contingent things. Like, I'm contingent, he could change me, but you're asking, can he change his necessary nature? That would mean that if his nature is necessary, the answer would be no. That would be a contradiction for a necessary thing to be able to be changed.
What is his necessary nature? Sorry.
Just the way that he is, just the set of his attributes.
Okay. So it really is just defining this being into existence. That's just how it comes across to me. It's just defining this thing to be what we recognize might be necessary things, and this thing just so happens to be the ultimate necessity.
It's not defining him into existence, because I gave an argument for why, and again, we can challenge aspects of that argument, but if we consider the collection of contingent things and ask, why does that collection exist? To me, that's a legitimate question. I could say it's due to a cause or due to chance. And if I'm going to rule out chance, which I have an argument for, then the other alternative is due to a cause, and then we're at a necessary being. So that's not arguing into existence. That's just making an argument. I mean, the problem of evil makes an argument, and I say, yeah, that's a legitimate argument. Now let me respond to where I think it might have a plausible alternative, so around its conclusion. Now you can do the same thing with the argument from contingency, but it's not just saying, oh, I've defined God exists because he's necessary. That's not what I'm doing. I'm arguing to his necessity. I'm not just defining him as necessary. When you brought up the problem of evil, though, yeah, I invoked his necessary existence because the problem of evil is an internal critique of theism. I can invoke presumed theistic doctrines because that's what's under attack.
I don't think we're going to get anywhere with this.
I mean, does that make sense, though? I mean, do you see kind of where I'm coming from?
I can sort of see where you're coming from.
A lot of people in the side chat now, I know that we do have mainly an atheistic audience. I'm not sure on a few of them, but a lot of people are in agreement that it's defined into existence. It was said in the chat before, you know, Carlton said it and a few people are agreeing. I'm just saying that's how it's coming across to the people. If the whole point of this is to put your argument across and to convince the people in the chat more so than Carlton, then that's just what it's coming across to the people in the audience, the same as what he's seeing. I'm just letting you know.
Oh yeah, sure, that's fine. And again, like, I recognize there can be disagreements. I mean, I'm not expecting that I'm gonna, oh, now you're all convinced. But I'm just saying it's not defining God into existence. I've made a several step argument that something, I mean, it's exhausted. Something is contingent or it's necessary. If we can consider all the contingent things, why do they exist?
Can I say something personally for me, without trying to show bias, but you do know that I am agnostic, man. But every time you say contingent, I think back 20 minutes to the contingency argument where he didn't agree with you. And it's like, you just have to accept this.
Yeah, this is the contingency argument.
This is the problem of evil.
Well,
No. We've been switching back and forth.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, maybe it's my fault.
It seems to be a circle to me. That's what I'm saying. It seems to be going, you know, it just seems to be going around in circles. That's.
Well, it's dependent on one another, right? Which is that the argument from contingency seems to be that there are these contingent things and there are these necessary things. Necessary things being laws of logic, and then contingent things being our existence.
Hold on. The laws of logic are not necessary things. They're necessary descriptions. The argument from contingency is about concrete things.
Okay. Splitting hairs. But the reason that we brought up, or I brought up at least, the necessity aspect in regards to the problem of evil is because it's sort of saying that this being now is at least it's coming across to me as this being the ultimate necessity, but this being also being, again, apologize, contingent upon these necessary descriptions. But with these necessary descriptions, necessary being laws of logic, therefore tying back into his definition of necessity, which, let me go back to that, I do apologize, being that it has to exist and is without a cause. Going back to, again, I do apologize, to the problem of evil, his God being this ultimate necessity, tying into his definition that we already have of necessity, it comes across to me, and apparently other people in the chat, that you truly are defining your God as this necessary being, given the definition of necessity that you already have.
Well, the definition of necessity that I have is just this. I mean, maybe not always used this way, but this is a pretty standard definition, something which must exist and without a cause. And if you're invoking the problem of evil, you have the burden of proof. And I'm not saying you're defending the problem of evil, we're discussing it. But if you are invoking that, I can draw upon theological doctrines. So I can say, even without having to prove them, I can just say, this is my stance. There's no logical contradiction in there being a necessary, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being. The problem of evil says, well, there is a contradiction in that. And for me to then appeal to an aspect of God's necessity is totally legitimate to do, because the problem of evil has the burden of proof. It's working with an internal critique.
Sure.
I mean, to me, that's just basic.
Right. I'm not objecting. I'm not objecting to the internal critique. What I'm objecting to is, and I brought it up before, what specifically about the God that makes it necessary, other than it coming across as, I've defined necessity as this thing, my God happens to fit this thing, and that's why I brought up the example of the androgynous fairies. I could do the same thing with them, defining them as necessary. Does that then, how do I, and use the same arguments that you're using? I'm not specifically sure how this would invoke or give credence to your position, other than, well, it sounds kind of logically cool, or as a combat medic that I know says, it's a salad argument. Essentially, it's both sound and valid, or at least it can come across that way.
Yeah, is that Dragnot?
Yes.
Well, again, I mean, I'm wondering, when you make that critique, because I mean, MathPig was kind of getting on me for jumping arguments, apparently. Which argument are we talking about? Are we talking about the problem of evil or the contingency argument?
I didn't feel like it was jumping on you for arguments. It's just, it just seemed like it was going around in circles. It just felt like we would agree on one, that we were, as I say, we had two topics, and to agree on one topic, you have to accept the other topic. And it just seemed like a little bit of going around in circles.
We could stick on one topic. I just want to make sure. I thought we had agreed we were shifting back.
Oh, no, that's my fault, man. That's my fault. And I just wanted to jump in to say I apologize if that's how it came across. And it just seems to accept one argument. I understood, and I did say that if it jumps between the two, that I'm not going to shout at you for doing that. I understand that they do coincide with each other, but coinciding with each other and being dependent on one another is different. And that's the only thing I'm trying to say, is it just seems that one of them has to be accepted to give preference to the other one. And I think that's where the problem that we're having is. And I generally don't think that we're going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
No, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to go anywhere more on this. So if you want to make two statements this time, Carlton, and if Dry wants to come back with the two statements, I'll have a look at the chat. There's lots of orange. We'll see if there's some questions, and we'll go from there and see what that is. So Carlton, if you want to make two statements on what Dry Apologist has said previous in this, and he can then come back at you, and I'll have a look for questions.
Sure. As I think Dry Apologist said this before, this discussion wasn't about us trying to convince each other. I think it was just both of us presenting arguments against one another, again, or just presenting our specific positions in regards to these two topics. Yeah. And I think it went pretty okay. There were I already know that there are parts where I'm like, I'm going to get my hand slapped for that. But I think because I've listened to quite a few Dry Apologist videos during this past week just to prepare for this, I wasn't surprised by a lot of the things that were brought up, and my objections that I had even before this still remain, because still sort of those foundational things as to the contingency and the necessity aspects. But I think that is an interesting sort of conversation to have another time. But yeah, I think this went pretty well.
Yeah, I thought this was it. Or sorry, were you done?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought this went well. I mean, I'm not, no hard feelings. I'm just going to defend my view. I'm told, hey, everybody's disagreeing with you. I'm going to push back. So to me, this got down to some foundational things, the nature of logic, the nature of a necessary being, the relation between the contingency argument and, the problem of evil. But yeah, I mean, these things can be talked about for a long time. I guess my only concern is just like how the two arguments got intermingled. And I don't think it's illegitimate at all for me to appeal to God's necessity in responding to the problem of evil, when the problem of evil is an internal critique of how I define God. So, and maybe that's not what was intended, but I just want to make sure that that's clear, that That was a little bit confusing, but anyway.
No, that's fine. I'm trying to do multiple things at once, so I do apologize. And
It wasn't you. It was just the whole context. I just want to make sure that my position is clear on that.
yeah. So any questions? We've got people. We've got infinite Mugo in question and answer time with no questions. You know, ask a question instead of asking, is it question and answer time? One thing I want to clear up, because they were talking about somebody did just drive past my house diffing, which is different than drifting. And I'm not going to swear and be nice, but they woke my daughter when she's running about up the stairs. Thank goodness for my woman. And shout out to my girlfriend for looking after the daughter tonight. Thank you very much, darling. I'd be lost without you. And if I ever find out who drove past my house at 10 past 1 in the morning, spinning their wheels in their car and making smoke, I will shoot you. But yeah, any questions? Anybody want to jump in? We're also, maybe if anyone's up for it, Carlton or Dry Apologist, if you could dedicate any more of your time, we can have a wee bit more unformatted version and back and forth. If you want to continue it, we can do an after party. But
Sure.
yeah, you've got 2 minutes to throw a question in, and then pting, I'm gone, people. We're gone. We've got God the Good One in here. We've got Rory. We've got Miss Sassy. Miss Sassy wanting to let me know Carlton. She says hi.
Hello,
Peter,
Sassy.
thanks very much for turning up. Nerdy's in there as always. Yeah, we've got the regulars here. I think there's 15 people here. And yeah, just wanted to say thank you very much. I know that there's other debates on and other more interesting channels out there than some Irishman talking. But I really do appreciate you all coming. And Dry and Carlton, thanks very much for even just letting it. I know it started off as just you coming back and a wee comment back and forth, and VC and video, it always gets you a wee bit further and a wee bit more. This conversation could have took 6 weeks in comment form. So yeah, if anyone, I'm not quite modern day debate, but feel free to, if you want to contact me, if you need to have a chat with someone, feel free. This is a free platform for everyone to have open conversation, and I'll shout back and forth against everyone. Think of South Park. Insult everybody, then you're grand. So seeing as with no questions from the chat, I'm going to round it all up. We'll probably be back in about 10-15 minutes. If anybody wants a link, I'm on Twitter, MathPig2. Send me a message, give me a follow, and I'll send you a link. And we could be back in about 15 minutes. So see you.